Yeah, so I kind of have this talk split into two parts. So the first part will be mainly about this soil water preferential flow story. Both of the projects I'm doing right now are kind of national in scope. So I'll talk about that stuff first, and then I'm gonna like bring it back to the grasslands where I know a lot of us kind of where our hearts are and where a lot of our research is. So that'll be, the second part will kind of be a case study on how this stuff is changing in grasslands with woody encroachment. So first, just talking about what preferential flow is and why we care about it. Usually when we think about soil infiltration into this water infiltration into the soil and the way that we often calculate it and model it, it's very uniform and it moves, the wetting front moves nicely through the soil at a constant rate, and it's moving through all the soil matrix spaces. And so we think of it kind of in this uniform wetting pattern through the soil. And preferential flow, in contrast, is kind of chaotic. It's much more difficult to model and quantify. And it's basically the really rapid movement of water through larger channels. So this can be through channels formed by roots or soil fauna that are creating burrows like earthworms, or like in our soils in Kansas that have a lot of shrink swell capacity, creating cracks. Those can also form as macropores. So basically the water is moving really quickly through those large pores and creating these kind of finger flow areas. And it's also bypassing a lot of the soil matrix. So it's really kind of a funneling effect. And you may have seen in studies or presentations when people do dye tracer studies to try and kind of qualitatively look at where this is happening. And you can see that finger flow deeper, kind of the uniform part, and then the finger flow deeper in the soil profile. And so these dye tracer studies are great, but it's kind of difficult to quantify preferential flow because it's kind of sporadic. It doesn't happen in all the parts of the soil profile. And so one way we try to do this, and the method that we used in this project I'm talking about today, is that uniform matrix flow. If you work with soil moisture, you can use like Darcy's law or Richard's equation to nicely estimate what you expect to happen with uniform flow based on soil conditions, soil texture, and soil structure. And so we have modeled matrix flow for any soil depth that we're looking at. And we can compare that to the actual soil velocity that we're measuring in the field. And if the velocity that we're measuring is faster than what we would expect for just that uniform flow, then we refer to that as preferential flow. So we call it the velocity threshold method. I won't go too much into the details unless people are really interested. But it's basically that the threshold is that expected movement based on matrix flow, and if it exceeds that, then we assume that preferential flow is happening. And it's a pretty conservative threshold that's set so that we're not overestimating preferential flow occurrence. So the reason that we care about preferential flow, it's important just for where soil moisture is found in the soil, which is important for plants and microbial activity and all sorts of things. But it's also important because the rate that water moves through the soil impacts things like how much and how quickly water gets into the groundwater system, which can impact local water yield. But preferential flow in particular has large impacts on water quality, because if you can imagine that if there's a pollutant available at the surface, that really rapid funneling of water deeper into the profile that bypasses kind of the filtering effect of the soil can result in a lot more pollutant transport into the groundwater, which is important for water quality. So that's kind of why I'm trying to convince you why preferential flow is important. And we also know from some recent work that we've been doing that it really is pretty ubiquitous. It's happening in ecosystems anywhere that we're really able to measure soil. We're seeing preferential flow occur after some portion of rain events. But it's almost never modeled that way. Most of the models that are using soil moisture to make predictions are not explicitly including preferential flow because we don't have a great understanding of when and why it's happening. So this project is using neon soil moisture data at neon sites to try to get a better understanding of that, basically. So if you're not familiar with neon sites, this is kind of a cartoon of how most of them are set up. So you have the flux tower as kind of the main part of the site. And then there's a transect along with many other sampling plots and locations. There's a transect of 5 soil plots where soil moisture is measured, kind of moving away from the tower. And so these 5 profiles at every site is where we're able to measure high resolution, either 1 or 5 minute soil moisture measurements. So it's a lot of data, and it lets you calculate those velocities based on when those rainfall events happen. So this is kind of where the measurements are taking place. And this is just a schematic of one of those profiles or one of those transects of 5 soil profiles and the multiple depths that we're then measuring soil moisture to try to calculate preferential flow. And so again, we're able to measure velocity at each of those points, and we do it by taking the timing of the precip event beginning and then the timing of when that soil moisture sensor actually responds. You divide it by the depth that it's at, and it gives you the velocity, how quickly it took the water to get to that sensor, basically. And so that's what we're comparing to that threshold of the modeled matrix velocity. And if our measured value is higher, then we assume it's preferential flow. So that's how we're getting these preferential flow values. So in some recent and ongoing work that's led by Bonan Lee, he's another postdoc at Oregon State, he's been looking really broadly across all these sites of the US to figure out what the main overall drivers are of preferential flow occurrence. And what he's found is kind of some of the main variables that come out in that analysis is the first one and main one is peak rainfall intensity. So how intense a rain event is. And so what they found is as you increase rain intensity, you're also increasing pretty dramatically your probability of getting preferential flow at a given site, which kind of makes sense intuitively. And then in contrast, this relationship's a little bit weaker, but as you move into more arid locations where the conditions are drier, you're also getting a slight decline in preferential flow occurrence compared to wetter, humid, and subhumid sites. And then there's also a soil component of this where when you move into areas that have higher clay contents in their soil, you're also increasing the probability of preferential flow occurring. So these factors are good to know, and it's very broad. So we're now interested in kind of digging deeper, no pun intended, at looking at how depth is changing, which of these drivers are important for preferential flow. Because we know that soil conditions change really drastically in some places when you move deeper into the soil. And also this is data from the KU field station NEON site for you guys. And we have preferential flow probability is on the x-axis, and the multiple profiles are being shown. But you can just see that as you move deeper into the soil profile, the probability of preferential flow and the variability between profiles changes. So we're interested in kind of delving more into that question of depth. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of findings that focus mainly on like storm conditions and more the climate side of this question. So the first thing we were interested in looking at was how deeply preferential flow propagates into the soil profile. And we care about this because if preferential flow is occurring a lot, but it's all in the top 30 centimeters, you might expect that it wouldn't impact something like groundwater recharge as much as if it was happening at a meter depth. So basically, when a rain event occurs, these blue squares are indicating that we go and find the deepest soil moisture sensor in each profile that responded with preferential flow. And then we look at that across all rain events that we have for a given site. So this plot is going to be showing mean peak storm intensity again on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we have that maximum preferential flow depth. And you have to kind of get your mind oriented where the top is shallower soil, and then you're going deeper into the soil as you move down the y-axis. And so what we see is that when you increase storm intensity, you're actually shallowing that deepest depth of preferential flow propagation. So the deepest values that we have are actually at the lowest values of mean peak storm intensity. And this was kind of an interesting result because if you remember, overall, when we're just thinking about how likely it is to occur, peak storm intensity has a really positive effect on preferential flow occurrence overall. But it looks like it actually is maybe concentrated in those surface soils rather than contributing to like deeper propagation of preferential flow. And so then I'll highlight the second question that we wanted to look at was, Bonan really was looking at the probability of whether or not preferential flow is occurring or would occur. And we've also been interested in when it does occur, how uniform is that across space? Like when you get a rain event at a site, is only one little area responding with preferential flow, or are you getting most of the sensors at that depth are responding with preferential flow? So with this kind of question, we might take a given depth, like 16 centimeters, and when a rain event comes in, we'll calculate what proportion of the sensors responded with preferential flow. So a value like 80% is a more uniform response, whereas deeper in the soil profile, you might expect a less uniform response and fewer sensors responding with preferential flow. So this is kind of that uniformity idea that we're thinking about. Sorry that these are kind of small. So on these plots, we have storm intensity again on the x-axis, and the y-axis is that uniformity proportion. So higher numbers mean more of the sensors are responding across space. And what we find here is that storm intensity, again, is having a positive influence. More intense storms are leading to more uniform responses, which again kind of makes sense as we think through it. But the interesting part is that as you move deeper into the soil profile, that relationship weakens as you go deeper and then disappears after you get past 70 centimeters or so. So storm intensity is really important overall, but its importance is mainly concentrated in the surface soils, which is where you also happen to get most of the preferential flow that we're recording. So it makes sense that that overall probability is heavily impacted by storm intensity. It's just not as important deeper in the soil profile. So in contrast, this variable is now mean storm sum, which is just the total amount of rainfall during a storm event. And then we still have uniformity on the y-axis. And so this storm sum also has a positive relationship with uniformity, but it persists at depth. So even when you're down at a meter depth, the total amount of rainfall during a rain event is influencing the uniformity of that preferential flow response across space. So together, as part of this project, it's kind of telling us that intensity is important for preferential flow uniformity at the surface and for overall occurrence of preferential flow. But when you move deeper into the soil profile, the total amount of rainfall is more important for the uniformity of that response deeper in the profile. So these are kind of climate-related topics. And part of the reason we're doing this across many sites in the US is that we're getting a really broad range of natural climate conditions at these sites and vegetation cover and soil types. And we want this then to help us predict if at your site, if storm intensity is projected to increase with climate warming, for example, how might you expect preferential flow to change in a given location? So this type of data will help us predict better what we expect to happen with these preferential flow dynamics. And we, as you guys are probably well aware, in northeastern Kansas, it's been getting wetter. We've been getting more annual rainfall over time, and we've also been starting to get larger rainfall events. And so all of these changes in precip patterns and variability have an influence then on whether preferential flow is occurring and how deep it's moving into the soil profile. Okay, and then I'm transitioning now. That was mainly climate focused, but we also know that land cover can have a big impact on soil moisture dynamics and what's happening below ground. And so I'm going to move into a case study for northeastern Kansas, tallgrass prairie, and looking at the land cover change that is woody encroachment and the spread of trees and shrubs in grasslands. And we've been doing quite a bit of work the last several years on how that affects hydrology of the system. So I'm going to share a little bit of that in the context of infiltration and preferential flow. So this one will focus more on this increase in shrub cover over time. And this work was all done at Kansa Prairie. Okay, so when we think about woody encroachment and hydrological dynamics, one of the main things that we've known for quite a while is that woody plants use a lot more water. Their transpiration rates on the canopy scale are quite a bit higher than the grasses that they're replacing. So when you move a bunch of shrubs in and replace grasses, you're increasing like landscape level evapotranspiration in a music grassland like we're in. So we're increasing the amount of water that's being pumped out of the subsurface, but you're also altering the structure of the subsurface because these shrubs and trees have larger and coarser and deeper root systems. So as they replace the really fibrous, shallow grass roots, they're altering channels, for example, for water movement, and all sorts of things, soil structure, microbial activity. So they really are kind of reshaping the subsurface. So I'm going to start by talking about drying, even though we're talking about water infiltration, because it's relevant. A lot of the work that we had started doing originally was thinking about that idea of increased transpiration leading to drying in deeper soils. And this is some work that was led by Carla Drecke, who's a postdoc now at UC Boulder. And so this data I'm going to show is electrical resistivity data. It's you basically nail a bunch of like big nails into the ground along a transect and like electrocute the ground. And then you measure resistivity and it gives you a proxy for soil moisture in a much larger area than you can get with like one soil moisture sensor. So that's what this data will be. And so we went out and measured electrical resistivity in June or in April when it was still pretty wet. And then again in October of the same year when you're in the drier end portion of the growing season. And so the idea was to look at during a growing season, how much did the soil, what was the like net drying over that growing season? And we split the transect into woody and grassy to see if that differed between those two cover types. So the data is kind of fun to look at. Darker colors, darker red colors indicate that there was more of a change in resistivity, which indicates more drying, and lighter covers indicate less drying has occurred. So you can see that like the grasses are doing their thing and taking up a ton of water in the surface, which is what they are really good at. But you can also see that in the deeper soil layers, you're getting a lot more of these pockets of drying down past a meter under the shrubs, where you're really not getting as much under the grasses. So this work, it links up with what we see with long-term neutron probe soil moisture records at Kanza, and just shows those zones of deep soil drying that we're getting under the shrubs. But we're also seeing with this same technique using that electrical resistivity, we can also look at how shrubs are impacting infiltration. So we're seeing that they're simultaneously drying the soil over long periods of time, and they're increasing infiltration to deeper soil layers, which is a little bit paradoxical kind of. But so this experiment using electrical resistivity, we had the same kind of transect set up across grassy and woody areas, but we set up sprinklers so that we could do like a mock rain event and then look at what happens with the soil moisture as time passes after that irrigation event. So this is a picture of Carla with one of the sprinklers that we're testing and set up. And these are the big, like huge water jugs that we had to drag up into the hill slopes of one of the watersheds to actually feed the irrigation machines. Okay, so this top panel is showing immediately or a couple hours after the irrigation event. And now the darker colors are indicating wetter conditions. So the darker the color is and the more negative the number, it means it got wetter in between when the irrigation event happened and when we're looking at the electrical resistivity. So 2 hours after, most of the wetting is right at the surface, which is what you would expect. But then as you kind of move forward in time, so now we're at about a day after and then about 36 hours after the event, you can see that under the grasses, there is infiltration of water, which we would expect, but it kind of stops and stagnates just below the grass rooting zone. So it's moving down. The grasses are essentially allowing the water to pool up where they would want to use it, which is smart of them. And then under the shrubs, you can see that there's this deeper infiltration of water. You can kind of see these shadows of darker colors moving deeper into the profile. And this is because of those coarse woody roots creating those channels for preferential water movement deeper into the soil profile. And so you're really not seeing that at all under the grasses. And again, this is the shrubs facilitating water movement deeper where they are the only ones that are able to get it. So it's very much like they're each kind of putting the water where they want it to be able to access it the most efficiently. So we're seeing this deeper infiltration in addition to the overall drying. And so we get increased ET with woody encroachment, we get deep soil drying and this deeper infiltration. But the net effect really, as we've been trying to look at, is drying. Like with the shrub encroachment, the ultimate impact is drying over long periods of time. So you might be asking yourself, why we care then if water is infiltrating deeper, if ultimately more of it is being used up and we're drying out the soil. And there's a lot of reasons. It impacts where soil moisture is in the soil profile, which is important for microbial activity and plant uptake and all that stuff. But the example I'm going to give is a little bit outside of my comfort zone. This is work led by Matt Kirk and his students who are groundwater chemists and hydrologists at K-State. But it's a cool kind of vignette looking at how what's happening on the surface has really cascading consequences on stuff down in the groundwater and the bedrock. And so the story here that they're finding is that as water moves through the soil and down into the bedrock and the aquifers, calcite weathering is happening all along the way because you have bedrock fragments in the soil that can be weathered, and then the water moves gradually down into the groundwater. And so in areas that mostly have grass cover and are less encroached, the water moves relatively slowly through the soil profile and eventually makes it into groundwater. And a lot of that weathering process actually happens in the soil, and the water is closer to equilibrium by the time it makes it into those groundwater bedrock aquifers. But when we get woody encroachment and we're increasing that rate of infiltration to deeper soil layers, we're reducing the soil water residence time. So whatever water is making it deep moves a lot faster through the soil, and there's less time for that weathering to be occurring in the soil. And so proportionally, a greater amount of the weathering is occurring in the aquifers in the bedrock. And so what that means is we're shifting the location of weathering and creating this more aggressive weathering agent in the bedrock and in the aquifers. And changing, if you guys are familiar with the geology of the landscape, it's a mirokarst system from different rates of weathering that creates kind of pockets of water and really complex flow paths underground. And so increasing weathering rates is going to shift all of those connections and the groundwater locations more quickly over time. So I just think this is a really fun story because it illustrates that I think we see woody encroachment, and it's really easy to see the changes in plant diversity and the loss of forage for livestock and all of the above ground things. But way down deep, down into the bedrock, we're still feeling the effects of woody encroachment, even down in the aquifers. So that's my reason, one of my reasons for why it's important to study this. So in conclusion, I'll try to wrap these two things or bring them together. When we get changes in climate and land cover, we can have big impacts on subsurface water fluxes. And one of those is the occurrence of preferential flow. And that these changes then have cascading consequences for a lot of things that are really important, like how much groundwater we have, what the water quality is of the groundwater, and how bedrock is weathering deep below the surface. And so doing something like this NEON project, where we're looking at preferential flow across a wide range of sites, can help us make better predictions about how soil water fluxes might change when we alter the climate or we alter the land cover in the future. So that's all I have for you today. There's a ton of people in both that preferential flow NEON project and this work at Kanza that have done a lot of this work as well. So that's all I've got. Yeah. Yeah, most of the work that we've done has been on dogwood, and then there's been a ton of work on eastern red cedar, mainly in more of the southern plains areas. And there are differences in the rates of water use and in their rooting systems. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done on the other clonal shrubs that are like the smooth sumac. I don't think we know as much about. We know some about its transpiration rates, but I don't think we know nearly as much, or some of the plum species. So we know a lot more about dogwood and eastern red cedar, but we don't know as much about some of the other clonal shrubs. Yeah, the question, I didn't repeat it last time, sorry. The question was, in really clayey soils like we have here, what's the relative importance of shrink swell cracks versus roots? I don't think we have really a very good idea of that. We've been doing this work that's more related to roots, but to my knowledge, there's not a ton of work done on the impact of those shrink swell dynamics. They're difficult to measure too with, it's just a big, like trying to catch them when they happen and be able to quantify it. But that's a great question. I think that would be a good direction for things to go. Yeah, that's the good bad question. Oh, and she was asking if kind of what are the consequences of having more weathering occurring in the aquifers as a result of woody encroachment. I don't know if I could say if it's a good or bad thing. I think that it is going to have big impacts on the connectivity of different aquifers and water sources below ground. And as that changes through time, it can have pretty big impacts. Like all the streams at Kanza are groundwater fed. So as things weather below ground and some of those connections change, there's the potential of altering something like stream flow over long periods of time. I also know it has impacts on CO2 levels in the water, which can impact pH. I don't know as much about the impacts on like water quality per se and stuff, but that would be a great question for Matt Kirk. Matt Kirk would answer that better. Yeah, so the question was about considering like a profile development index or bringing horizonization into trying to look at where and when preferential flow is occurring. We are starting to do some work at that. There's a Aaron Cope who used to be at KU, has is it profile development index? Okay. And so he's we potentially will be able to calculate those for these neon sites and then be able to look at it. We've tried to split up into horizons, but it's so inconsistent across sites. And we also have soil moisture from each of those profiles, but we really only have soil structure and horizon information from one location nearby. So we're still kind of working out how to do that in the best way, while incorporating that data, but not getting too far away from what we're actually seeing. But I think that is very true, that those things like clay content and soil structure are changing a lot as you move from horizon to horizon. Yeah. So the question was about kind of how these soil moisture dynamics are impacting both stream flow and also stream water chemistry or water quality. Is that right? Yeah, there's a lot of work at Kanza that deals with like stream chemistry, and they're looking a lot more at those changes. And this, especially that weathering project with Matt Kirk, there's been a lot more starting to integrate the two together, like the plant part and what's happening in the soil moisture dynamics, and then what's actually happening with stream flow. At Kanza, at least, there's in reaching groundwater and then in stream flow, there's not a very big runoff component. So it really is mostly movement vertically and then groundwater feeding of the streams. But it still is the same thing where these dynamics are impacting what gets to groundwater and then what makes it into stream flow. So I'd say there's starting to be more work that kind of integrates across those areas, but yeah. Yeah, that's where I think that bypassing that like filtering effect that you get when water is moving through all of the small pore spaces and has the ability to potentially get rid of some of those pollutants as it moves through. Yeah, I think that to my knowledge, there's not a ton being done on that specifically at Kanza and some of these northeastern Kansas sites, but I think that especially in more agricultural areas, I think that is important. Yeah. Yes, that's like, I'm excited to do more of that. There's like a lot of management in the Great Plains that you're removing the above ground vegetation, which is great for you're cutting off that like evaporation or the transpiration problem. And it's similar. I do some work in South Africa, and they have a lot of the same where they're repeated cutting, clearing of woody vegetation. But no, I don't think we know. So you can imagine that when roots grow, they're creating channels and they shrink and swell themselves as they have more and less water. And so you're creating channels for water movement. But then when you cut down the plant and the roots die and start to decay, you leave those channels and they don't rebound immediately. And they have altered rhizosphere conditions, and they often are pretty stable. And so I don't think we have a great idea of how that then impacts. I imagine that it would enhance the effect of increasing preferential flow, but I don't think we know how long that remains or really what the effects are. So yeah. And let people go a little early before Thanksgiving break. Yeah, thank you guys for coming.